The worst thing I could say about Sir Clive Sinclair, a quirky if generally likeable guy, was that he wasn't good at business. That's it really. You call something the real Sir Clive, but well, the real person's a pretty good guy. Now there's no need to call this one the real Jack Tramiel though. You know what this guy's all about. Again, we've looked at him a couple of times in videos, Specky vs C64 again, the Amiga vid, but I want to do a full profile. The most ambitious, the most driven, the most brutal. Even a picture of Tramiel is enough to strike fear in your heart. Imagine having to walk into a room, having to sit at the end of a table with him at the other end. You know it's not going to end well. So Tramiel's getting his time in the sun. We're going from the beginning all the way up to his Pyrrhic victory in the Great American Micro Wars. Now there's no denying it, Jack Tramiel had it rough growing up. He was born an only child to a Jewish family in Lodz in Poland in 1928, and during World War II he and his family were moved from the Jewish ghetto to Auschwitz and then to Arlem, where his father died, likely killed by a gasoline injection. Tramiel himself was examined by Josef Mengele. Now I can't possibly imagine the effect that it has on a person to spend their formative years in concentration camps, so I'm not about to try. All I will say is that Tramiel spent a large part of the rest of his life giving talks about the Holocaust across the country, and he was a founding supporter of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. After the war and liberation, he married Helen Goldgrub, herself a survivor of Belsen, and emigrated to the USA in 1947, aged 18, joining the army in 1948. This was where he would learn to repair office equipment. After 4 years he left and with a GI loan set up a repair shop, Commodore Portable Typewriter, in New York. This didn't work out, so at some point he moved to Toronto where, in 1955, he set up Commodore Business Machines. Initially they imported and sold Czechoslovakian typewriters. This business did last, but not without some pretty rocky roads. Commodore's first bout of notoriety might not seem interesting, but it is quite important. In 1965, CBM were caught up in the Atlantic acceptance scandal. It's a whole load of financial stuff, but basically, one of Canada's biggest savings and loan companies fell apart, and a big cause of that was financial corruption. The head of the company, C. Powell Morgan amongst a myriad of dodgy deals, had several shady agreements with Tramiel, because they were friends. Oh, and also because Morgan was the chairman of CBM. It is also quite possible that Tramiel tried to obscure the inquiries and various trials that fell out from this mess by altering documents and lying under oath. The scandal was huge, one of the biggest financial scandals in Canadian history, and a fair few people associated with it went to jail. But not Tramiel. As convinced as the authorities were of his guilt apparently, they lacked evidence against him. Powell Morgan himself, the man at the head of it all, died of leukemia in 1966. Such a scandal could have been the end of CBM regardless, of course, if not for one man's intervention. That man was Irving Gould, a very rich financier, someone who'd had his own dealings with the courts in the past, and who'd made his money from distribution, shipping containers and the like. And yeah, he's just quite mysterious, especially when it came to the accumulation of cash. For whatever reason, he saved CBM. His financial support replaced the bad money from Atlantic that was propping up the company. Gould injects the money, becomes the new chairman of the board at CBM, and Jack Tramiel, whether he likes this or not, is now in Irving Gould's pocket. For all Tramiel's hills and valleys to come, Irving Gould will always have it over him that in 1968 he saved his ass. Tramiel would move his business to California in the same year. For the next few years, Tramiel works like a dog. He spent every day of his working life working as if the whole balloon could burst tomorrow. If necessary, he could go to Gould and ask for more capital, although the answer more often than not was no. Gould had too much interest in other things to care enough. Several expensive homes, a massive yacht, jets and so forth. Seriously, the guy was stupid levels of rich. You might wonder if he knew about anything at all, but he certainly did know something about one thing: tax law. This was how he got Commodore incorporated in the Bahamas, even though the company had nothing whatsoever to do with the Bahamas. When you're Gould, you get to become an expert at ensuring you have as much money as possible, I suppose. One part of this is bending tax law to your will, and another part is making sure that Jack Tramiel stays hungry, for that way he stays vicious. For a few years, CBM thrived in the calculator business, which was where Tramel's true qualities as a businessman first shone: his brutality. He lived by a famous three-word credo: business is war. The most naked admission in many ways of what business truly is. Tramiel revelled in destroying his competition and pricing them out of the market, in setting suppliers, retailers against each other and then screwing both of them. It was his absolute passion. Basically, Jack Tramiel was a very, very good businessman. I would like to stress he is, according to a lot of people's personal accounts, a very good guy, affirming, friendly, gregarious, charming, so long as you're in his good books. Trouble was, no one could figure out how to actually stay in Tramel's good books for all that long, and as soon as you weren't, well, you were an enemy, someone to terminate with extreme prejudice. In a way though, you almost admire it. Tramel's drive is supernatural. Not necessarily motivated by the accumulation of cash, but a desire for conquest, to be a king sitting on a blood-red throne. This all worked out well until an even bigger fish came along: Texas Instruments. Already a huge company primarily thanks to defense electronics and military applications, their movement into consumer electronics in the 70s would be decisive and dominant in the US. They started selling calculators and the like, and in doing so, virtually wiped CBM out. They could outmatch them in every department, primarily because they could make all the chips themselves, whereas CBM was still reliant on supplies. So there was simply no way that CBM could match them for price. Texas Instruments routed them all across the field, sending CBM into full retreat. Another important event for several reasons. Tramiel was on the brink again, and in 1975 he had to go back to Gould, who, for a second time, had to put his hand in his wallet and prop the company up. A bad experience for Tramiel, undoubtedly, as the pocket he's in gets ever deeper. Secondly, he would use a part of that capital to buy the chip-making company that would take CBM into their next evolution, MOS Technology. And thirdly, he would never ever ever forget this. Texas Instruments had almost driven Jack out of business. He was left beaten, bloody and scarred, but not dead. And as Texas Instruments would find out, if Jack's not dead, then he's gonna come back at you forever until one of you is dead. Maybe until everybody is dead. MOS Technology, like Commodore, were somewhat down on their luck in 1976. A lot of their revenue came from designing integrated circuits for calculators, and that too was scuppered heavily when TI came into the calculator market using their own chips. Before then, MOS had already laid the groundwork for the future of home computing. A team of 8 ex-engineers from Motorola, fresh off of creating the Motorola 6800, came to MOS looking to improve further. The most famous of whom, and one of the single most important people when it comes to the rise of the personal computer, was a man named Chuck Peddle. Peddle and his all-star team of engineers, a more talented group of which you're not likely to find anywhere, created their most important work in 1975, the MOS 6502. It was a true leap forward. It was more powerful and just as featured as every other microprocessor on the market. And also it cost $25 at a time when other processors cost $300 abouts. The 6502 is one of the most important chips of them all. You can find it or variations of it in the Apple II, the Atari 2600, the Atari 800, the BBC Micro, oh, and the NES. And ultimately the Commodore PET, VIC-20 and 64. It's a pretty important chip, in other words. This brilliant little chip, one that Peddle would take all over America, gave MOS their name, but then Motorola came along with a lawsuit. In reality, MOS's team hadn't copied anything from their former company, but the low level of understanding of these brand new chips in the legal world gave Motorola all that they needed to win and hit MOS with punishing fines. The only comfort being that MOS were able to sacrifice their inferior 6501 chip to the lawsuit as opposed to the 6502. Commodore, already one of MOS's customers and desperate for the vertical integration that was needed to challenge TI, purchased MOS with the added condition that Chuck Peddle would join Commodore outright as their chief engineer. The deal, the most important one Commodore ever made, was carried out with typical Tramielian ruthlessness. Essentially, he withheld payments from MOS until they could make enough profit to swoop in as their saviour. and this was achieved with the help of the man over at Commodore UK, Kit Spencer. The deal cost Commodore less than $1 million. It was a bargain for a whole chip company. Jack Tramiel is very good at getting deals, you see. A brief word perhaps on just what made up Commodore at the time. For an American company, their success had actually come mostly in Europe at this stage. It would take until the arrival of the VIC-20 for them to really make a massive impact at home. But this is a video about Jack Tramiel, not Kit Spencer. The parent company was Commodore International Limited, created by company chairman Irving Gould and running out of the Bahamas. From there they had divisions all over the world: Germany, UK, Canada, Switzerland, Japan, Hong Kong. All of these largely ran without much interference from Tramiel, with their own general managers. People like Kit Spencer, Tony Tokai of Japan, mostly famous for the VIC-1001 and Max machines, and much later David Pleasance of Commodore UK. The US division was CBM, because that was run by Jack Tramiel with Dick Sanford as his then underboss. Now you may think I'm over-egging the cake with a mafia comparison, but Jack used to call the 20 or so people who he was closest with in the company the inner family. A circle of people from all over Commodore's empire, all in different positions who Jack considered friends and who benefited greatly from that. Jack only truly trusted these people and his sons. It's a huge company, in other words. As a general rule of thumb, the US operation is a bit of a madhouse due to all the micromanagement and general brutality that's going on. But the other worldwide divisions are relatively stable and usually functioning successfully. They're normal in all the ways that CBM aren't. As such, they are mostly not the subject of this video. This is mostly all about CBM. So when I speak of some kind of Tramiel person screwing atrocity, as I will often, you can assume that largely the opposite of this is happening in other territories. There are many bad things about Tramiel, of course. He'd make decisions on a whim, he was actually fairly easily influenced, and he could be brutal. Although never too personally. Almost everyone who actually worked with Jack says that while he's got his bad side, you want to work with him. You would never trust anyone in the trenches more, that his drive was inspiring, his will to succeed unmatched. A favoured and probably apt comparison is the one to General Patton, the one who lived and breathed war the most. Jack did not tolerate bullshit or incompetence, but especially the former. Trying to bullshit Jack never worked, and the usual result was a Jack attack. Think Gordon Ramsay. You are shouted at for a lengthy period, usually with the door open so everyone else can hear what an idiot you are. Jack breaks down every single thing that you're doing wrong, and at the end of it you respond. It's basically a test. If Jack appreciates that you won't screw up again, you'll probably get away with a punishment tour. Jack likes to send people on months-long tours all around Commodore's empire, away from their families, doing unimportant jobs away from the action. If your response is weak, an excuse or a desperate justification, well, you're fired on the spot. Many people, mostly managers, didn't survive their first Jack attack. The revolving door at Commodore was in management. Regular engineers were usually quite safe, but management? Well, the story used to go like this. Guy tries to get in with Jack, does so, gets assigned a management position, screws up, tries to hide it, gets Jack attacked, gets fired. Repeat ad infinitum. Jack attacks were so famous that some wags actually named a game after them, which you're seeing here. Jack himself was apparently quite amused by that. So it takes quite a strong stomach to go to him face to face and tell him that everything needs to change, especially when he surely desires to remain in calculators and defeat TI at their own game no matter what. But Chuck Peddle? Well, he was no shrinking violet himself, and that's exactly what he did. He went to Tramiel and convinced him that calculators were basically a dead end and that the home computer was the next big thing. He'd already produced a fairly successful and very early micro, the KIM-1, just before Commodore's acquisition of MOS, and Commodore were now selling these at an acceptable rate. While reluctant and not ready to get rid of the calculator business quite yet, Tramiel agreed to let Peddle have a shot at the computers. Now my reckoning is that Tramiel was no fool. If home computers were the next big thing, as Peddle said they were, then Texas Instruments would surely be in there before too long. He wanted to be there before that, and to be ready for them. Call it the second front, the micro theatre. Of course, by this time Tramiel had already somewhat developed a terrible reputation for himself, and Commodore were already regarded as a bunch of disreputable blackguards. As a result of this, Pedal's all-star MOS 6502 team was torn apart, primarily because most of them had no desire to work for Tramiel. And CBM was still perpetually short of cash, with Gould unwilling to inject any more. No matter. In Pedal, CBM had the first of many genius engineers under their belt. His team's computer was one of the first highly notable and popular micros out there, a part of the so-called Trinity of 1977 with the Apple II and TOS-80. Here it is, Commodore's most beautiful machine, the none more 70s Commodore PET. An evolution in many ways of Pedal's previous KIM-1, with a glorious monitor, keyboard and dataset that make it a masterpiece of integrated design, that metal case. The PET is a true computer of tomorrow, the most sci-fi computer ever, with all the obvious allusions to 2001: A Space Odyssey you can eat. It deserved to sell millions, which it didn't. Of the Trinity of 1977, the PET was announced first, came out last, and sold the least. But it still sold plenty enough to make an impact. As a computer, well, these days there's not a whole lot you can do with it. Only a few games, not a lot of memory, a mere 4 kilobytes at first, although this would grow. But, you can still certainly learn to code on it, and plenty of people did. It made a lot of waves over here too, where the PET was quite possibly the first computer to be at least semi-common in educational and business establishments. Commodore were already quite known over here for their calculators, which were very successful. They already had a distribution network over here, whereas Apple and Radio Shack did not. For us, the PET is pretty close to Genesis, the point where the home computer arrived. And so, while Commodore were faced with stiff competition in the States, they started to sink their claws in the European market, particularly here in the UK, and especially in what would become the home of Commodore in Europe, West Germany. Another big thing to note about the PET is the deal that Commodore made with Microsoft for a version of their BASIC that could be put on a ROM and integrated into the PET. A good thing seemingly, as it would make the PET's BASIC considerably harder to steal, which everyone did back then when it was on disk. Bill Gates himself was not a fan of the idea because he thought the ideas behind the PET were a load of rubbish, and basically hand-waved it away. Do whatever you want, just go away because it's gonna fail. And so Commodore made a quick fixed price deal with Microsoft. Unlimited usage of that BASIC for any Commodore-made 6502 based computer. Forever. What a deal, huh? A frequent example given of the tightness of Jack Tramiel is that he stuck with this original deal for years, never updating the BASIC. But then with a deal like that, you could see why. After all, getting an update off of Microsoft would mean renegotiating it. And while the cost of the deal has never truly been revealed, it's known to be a spectacularly low amount of money, as little as $10,000. The BASIC in every Commodore computer unit up to and including the C64 cost the company less than a penny to include. Presumably Jack Tramiel would never let Bill Gates forget just how big a win he got over him here, something that very few people would do again, although the initial meeting was pedals and a lot of the intricacies of the deal were down to Commodore's then head of engineering, André Soussan. The PET goes down in history as the computer that sold the least of the 1977 Trinity, but that mostly had to do with the computer limping out of the gates thanks to Irving Gould being tight with the purse strings and not giving the money needed to increase production to a level that met the demand. Basically every PET was hand-assembled. Besides, the TOS-80 was never not going to be number one, it's in stores all over the States. Initially the PET made a big splash at computer shows all over the country, with Pedal as the master salesman, selling the computer for a brilliant Tramiel strategy. Give us a check for $795 and you get an 8K PET within 90 days. If you don't get it in that time, you can ask for your money back. This injection of funds was necessary as the company was still really struggling financially at the time, and although a lot of people ended up having to wait 6 months or so for their computer to arrive, the company was still making money. The consumer does actually still have to make that decision to forget about it and get their cash back, which they're not necessarily going to do on day 91. Indeed, apparently no one did. Pedal is, of course, the superstar here, a fantastic engineer and salesman, the sort of person you have to take a photo of to prove that they exist, But credit certainly goes to Tramiel also for getting fully behind the computers, and his plans that at the time pretty much saved the company again. It wasn't all down to Chuck, although most of it certainly was. As awful as Tramiel can be, he is very good indeed at what he does. And so Commodore had made their first splash in the world of computers. They'd arrived and they'd certainly made a mark, a little one in the US and a big one in Europe. They also had their own chips, which, as it turned out, loads of other people wanted. When Apple or Atari want more MOS 6502s, they have to go ahead and talk to Commodore. Ergo, their success also benefits Commodore. They may not be upgrading any of that now that most of the team's buggered off, but they're sure as hell selling it. They are a firm and important part of the burgeoning home computer business, and worth quite a bit of money. So what would the man who some have even credited with the invention of the personal computer, Chuck Peddle, be rewarded with for this success? Well, gradually he got Tramielled. The relationship between Jack and Chuck was always tempestuous, and he'd already quit the company once before 1980 to go to Apple. Over time it would gradually sour more and more thanks to various events, talk of company reorganisation misinterpreted as mutiny, and a general pulling in different directions. This will be a common theme, because Tramiel's just that sort of person. The sort of person who takes no one being bigger than the boss to an extreme, who doesn't truly see the good in anyone. If someone's becoming successful and making a name for themselves, well, sooner or later they're going to be a problem, because they're going to get big ideas. They're going to want the top job. So get them before they get you, especially if they're not a part of the family, which Chuck, for all his close workings with Tramiel, never was. For such a commandeering personality, Tramiel always seems frightfully insecure in his position. Maybe he was right to be with Gould breathing down his neck. Who knows? But for now we move on. It is worth noting though that in 1980 Jack had his second brush with death. His pet jet set on fire in the air and very nearly went down. This was hushed up at the time as Jack did not want such a near miss to affect Commodore's rising but still unstable stock price. To the next computer then, the VIC-20. Here's one of the most important figures involved in the genesis of the VIC-20. Yep, believe it or not. Not directly of course, but Jack Tramiel found inspiration for the VIC-20 in a trip to the UK and seeing the ZX80 in action. He was apparently quite surprised to see just what his former competitor in the calculator market was doing. While the PET did see some success in the UK, it was not a home computer. It cost over £1,000, a price that the average British home could ill afford back in the days of the 3-day week and winter of discontent. But then here's Clive, selling his microcomputers for £100, a price that many could happily afford, and there was to date no true American equivalent. Tramiel loved the idea of the ZX80 and wanted his own Sinclair killer. This was also the genesis of his most famous phrase, computers for the masses not the classes. Now this was the true breakup with Chuck Peddle, who was pushing for an Apple killer, the TOI, a strong business computer that he wouldn't let go of despite Tramiel's indifference to it. After many arguments, Jack closed Chuck's Moore Park facilities and reduced his stand-in to nothing, reasserting to Chuck his status as the boss. Faced with Milton's desk in the basement, Peddle was out of there. Soon he would find his next company, Sirius, pounded into oblivion by Jack in the courtroom, and he would lose all his lucrative stock options at Commodore. You can check out any time you like, but you can never leave. The VIC-20 was built cheap and innovated nowhere. It was almost totally made up of stuff that Commodore already had. They already had the same BASIC that was in the PET, that's a given. The VIC stood for Video Interface Chip, which was something that another great Commodore engineer, Al Charpentier, had designed in 1977 and was a variation on the 6502, the 6560. The original idea was possibly for the chip to be used in a console or an arcade machine, but that never happened and it was shelved, until it was dredged up, barely upgraded, and shoved into the computer. Most of the other development was done at Commodore Japan under Tony Takai, where the computer was the VIC-1001, with the help of not only a great team of engineers, but a small software club that included none other than the future head of Nintendo, the late great Satoru Iwata. They created versions of Pac-Man and the like which were sold despite possible copyright concerns. In the end though, the VIC-20 came out in the US in the summer of 1981, inferior to most but not in price. At $300, it was $200 less than the Atari 800, its nearest competitor. Jack's instincts were correct. A lot of Americans were very hungry for a low-cost computer, and the VIC-20 was a roaring success, the first computer to sell over 1 million units in America. Of course, in order to do this, Jack Tramiel had to screw over a lot of people. In these days, every computer company had their trusted band of retailers, and computers were always sold in specialist shops. Makes sense, I mean, they cost so much, so it's a major purchase. You're going to want some expert advice on that, aren't you? Commodore, who'd always struggled in this department compared to the likes of Radio Shack, saw things another way. I mean, the computer's $300, the selling point is the price. Who the hell needs an expert for that? So the VIC-20 was the first computer to be sold on regular consumer store shelves, in particular Kmart. And suddenly the retailers are screwed. Someone can go to them, get all the advice they need, walk straight out and go to the big shop next door and buy the computer they want for a crap load cheaper. The whole way that computers are sold is changed forever. Or at least for the next couple of years. To call this a scorched earth tactic would be underselling it. Jack gathered the retailers, told every single one of them to fuck off, and replaced them all with William Shatner. The Shatner advertising campaign concentrated on the VIC-20 being more than just a games machine, capable of lots of business stuff, homework and all sorts. But hey, it played good games as well. And it's always good to have such a familiar face selling something that's on the shelves of your local supermarket. The VIC-20 for games wasn't anywhere near the capability of the Apple II or the Atari 800. But even so, the success of the machine meant that it would soon develop a neat little library of its own, and Jack and Commodore had no quibbles when it came to the folks publishing software on their machine, nor any pretensions as to what the computer should be used for. They spoke to both adults and kids equally, presenting an upstanding picture to the adults, while knowing what the kids really wanted. The VIC-20 is, no matter which way you look at it, an unqualified success. In the US micro story, it fills the role of the ZX80 and ZX81 combined. But is it enough? What's Commodore's blood rival doing? Actually, Texas Instruments' involvement in computers had already started in 1979, with the TI-99/4. On announcement, people predicted that TI would dominate computers just as they had done with calculators and consumer electronics in general. But it didn't work out that way. While the TI-99/4 was actually the first 16-bit computer on the market, it was beset by issues and a very expensive price. The former military giants had made a stuttering start, missing the mark with their first attempt and finding themselves outgunned, not by Commodore but by Apple, Atari and Radio Shack. But come the summer of 1981, they'd regrouped and rearmed themselves. The war was truly about to begin. Texas Instruments' TI-99/4A, for a brief time, lorded it over the opposition. It was greatly improved from the original /4, available for a reasonable sum of $525, and adverts for it were filled with bedazzling graphics and the like. It can run games like Pac-Man great. And it had a cartridge system, meaning that you didn't have to wait ages for anything to load on floppies or tapes. With Apple and Atari both spinning their wheels, the computer dominated the rest of 1981. And yes, TI did the same thing as Commodore. The computer was available on mass merchandising shelves immediately. As all the poor beleaguered computer dealers sat crying into their eggnog, Commodore realised that cutting the price of the VIC-20 would only take them so far. They needed something more. At least their engineers did, the twin architects of the C64, Al Charpentier and Bob Yanes. Of course, the best thing to do would be to try and innovate, do more with the 6502 line, build a true 16-bit system. But wait, that costs money? Bullshit. Jack Tramiel wasn't having anything of that. The new computer would be 8-bit again. You see, Jack Tramiel is the sort of person who doesn't believe in budgets, and by that I don't mean you can spend whatever you want. In Tramiel's eyes, giving somebody a budget was basically giving them a license to steal. They would go ahead and spend all of that money. They wouldn't make any decision that would take them under that budget. So, yes, he was a tightwad. Anything that cost the company more than $1,000 had to be personally approved by Jack himself. Jack was the absolute captain of the ship, a detail-seeking, equal amount in each muffin micromanager, the definition of domineering. When he wasn't in the office to approve anything, no work ever actually got done. The new Commodore computer could have easily been an utterly backwards pile of garbage that was virtually rotting on its arrival, if not for the brilliant engineers Commodore had working for them. Usually young folks, hired because they were young and that meant they could be paid a lot less than a more experienced guy, but people with their own interesting approaches and ideals. Charpentier made a proper full upgrade of the VIC 2, absolutely full of tricks that squeezed everything possible from those 8 bits. And Bob Yanis? Well, he made the sound interface device, the SID chip. A device that still bedazzles even today. It's basically a fully featured synthesizer on a frickin' chip. People still struggle to decipher just how he managed to pull that off. The rest of the computer's tricks were based on bank switching, meaning most importantly that the computer could lay claim to 64 kilobytes of memory. No one was less interested in the technical workings of a computer than Jack was, but he knew a good number when he saw it. Still, the actual naming of the system, originally known as the VIC-40, was down to Kit Spencer, who suggested the Commodore 64 in order to really hammer that number home. Charpentier and Yanis did all of this with basically no money. They didn't have it to spend. I mean, the computer was a pile of rubbish in some regards, whether it was a horrendously slow disk drive, still having that ancient BASIC, or the fact that Tramiel was so tight that he wouldn't even have a new case design for it, reusing the one from the VIC-20. But in so many other regards it overachieved, to the point where the failings became almost cute idiosyncrasies. The field was virtually cleared come the winter of 1982. Apple's computers were looking a bit old, especially the Apple II. Atari's even more so, they hadn't released anything since 1979. 5 years down the line, no one aside from the most out there hacker has really figured out what the Trash 80 even is. The stage is set. Commodore in one corner, Texas Instruments in the other. The latter is looking to dominate the market and do away with Commodore once and for all. The former, motivated by nothing but revenge. There would be no pretense of a good clean fight, the gloves were already off. War was imminent, the bloodiest war in the history of American microcomputing. Texas Instruments struck the first major blow mere days before the launch of the C64 with a move that nobody could have seen coming. If you buy the TI-99/4A, you will get a $100 rebate. Boom! What a hit! Sure, the benefit will only be reaped a few months later, but essentially they'd knocked $100 off the price of their computer. At this point a TI-99 cost $300 without the rebate, a VIC-20 was $250, and a C64 was $600. So a /4A was effectively $50 less than the low-end machine. Despite an immediate price cut of the VIC-20 to $175, Texas Instruments won the Battle of Christmas 1982 decisively, outselling the VIC-20 3-1. The VIC-20 was down, but not out. As we'll soon see, it still had an important role to play. Commodore redoubled their efforts on the C64 with a marketing campaign that relentlessly hammered home those crucial numbers and was openly savage towards all the competition. It was a tactic that would besmirch their name with just about every other major computer company, but they, or rather Tramiel, didn't care. And yes, they went ahead and screwed the dealers again. Jack truly promised this time that the dealers would have the C64. He gave them his word, and indeed they did have it at Christmas. Not long after this, having savaged them utterly, Jack cut ties with all of his remaining computer dealers. The stakes in the war become ever greater in 1983 thanks to the video game crash. Now all of a sudden the computers are the leaders in that market too. Everything seemed up for grabs. But the truth was, Tramiel had already won. It was just a question of by how much. This was the decisive strategy, to compress Texas Instruments with a pincer movement. On the low end, thanks to the general cheapness of the VIC-20, Jack could keep cutting that machine forever. There was no way that the TI-99/4A would ever be cheaper than the VIC-20. And on the high end, well, the C64 wasn't exactly expensive either. There was plenty of room for cutting. And while TI-99's cartridges had their positives, in the end, it was too much vertical integration, an attempt to capture the software revenue stream that failed because, well, having to have all software licensed by TI was an unappetizing proposition compared to the C64, where you could just do whatever the hell you wanted. That little bit of freedom on the software front was what made the C64 tick, the decisive advantage. For TI to chase the VIC-20, as they were doing, was like chasing a white whale, and all the while the C64 was bearing down on it from the top. TI would be crushed. Faced with this, there was nothing that TI could do but desperately keep on going lower, which they did, and it never changed a thing. By the time that the TI-99 had reached 150, it was breaking even. And no, Commodore weren't finished by then. The cuts would continue, so that the TI had to go lower even than that, selling the computer at a loss and literally not profiting from anything. And my god, that $100 rebate turned out to be a terrible idea. By the end of it all, TI were basically paying consumers to take their freaking computers. And the cuts continued. They would not stop. Soon the C64 itself was available, on the shelves, for a mere $200. There was nothing more to be done. In October of 1983, with a final Hell's Heart I Stab at V movement of dumping all remaining inventory on the market for less than $50 apiece, Texas Instruments left the computer industry, thoroughly beaten into submission. Jack Tramiel had his revenge. The decade of anger that followed TI nearly putting him out of business had truly manifested itself. TI were utterly cowed, and it would be a long time before they would even remotely consider entering the computer market again. Jack Tramiel had won. But what of those great men, Al Charpentier and Bob Yanes? They received no raise, no promotion, still engineers, barely above the breadline. Unhappy with this, they left and were treated in much the same way as Chuck Peddle was. On trying to form a new computer company, Tramiel smothered them with litigation. Behold the king. Things should have been just great. They really should have. Come the end of 1983, Commodore are riding spectacularly high. They've beaten their main rivals, Texas Instruments, out of the market altogether. Atari have imploded spectacularly. Apple are struggling somewhat, unable to truly move beyond the now somewhat outdated Apple II. Even the Apple Lisa, the first ever computer to come with a graphical user interface, is not a performer. Radio Shack are also wondering just what to do next, unable to follow the TRS-80 with another successful product. IBM, while holding down business, have not been able to make any kind of dent in the home, something that continues in 1984 with the release of an utter flop by the name of the PC Junior. Commodore are now virtually unopposed in the home computer market. They lead it by a long, long distance. Jack Tramiel sits atop of his blood-red throne. But not for long. In spectacular fashion, on January the 16th, 1984, Jack Tramiel announces that he is resigning from Commodore. The information was scarce. Some people knew that a week or so previously, at the Winter CES show where Jack had announced that Commodore had made $1 billion in sales over the previous year, he'd had a huge argument with Irving Gould behind closed doors. Not uncommon, but this one was particularly savage, and Jack walked out of it. On January the 13th, in the boardroom, that all came to a head once more. Tramiel walked out of the boardroom that day, walked out of the office, and never set foot into Commodore's headquarters again. There's a lot of speculation, of course. Let us never forget who was behind the throne. For nearly 20 years, Jack Tramiel had been in Irving Gould's pocket. His money was essential to the company's continued survival, and Gould had more shares. In a straight fight, the boardroom would have always backed Gould. Despite all this, Jack ran the company as if it were his own. Largely, Gould did not have a problem with this, but some have wondered if Gould thought that the way Tramiel had reached the top, through scorching every single thing in his path, getting rid of so many people, micromanaging the whole thing like his typewriter shop, was actually tenable. Maybe he'd just made one too many enemies. While Commodore had made $1 billion, Gould wanted more. He wanted Commodore to be run like a Fortune 500 company, which it wasn't. More than that, Tramiel had already anointed his successors. They were his sons, Sam, Gary and Leonard, all groomed for the top through the best education and experience in specific areas, management, finance and tech respectively, and all very capable. For Jack, Commodore had always been a family business. It's highly likely that Gould did not see things the same way. But let's not be kind to Irving Gould here. The most detailed report on what happened that day comes from one of those sons, Leonard. Apparently, Irving Gould was treating the assets of Commodore as if they were his own personal fund, presumably taken from them as he saw fit for whatever Gould needed said money for. Jack said that Gould couldn't do this while he was still president, and Gould had one word to say in response: goodbye. We will never fully know for sure what happened. All of those reasons why are perfectly believable. And we will never hear anything from the horse's mouth. Jack barely spoke of it while he was alive, and, well, you think Irving Gould would have gone to some sort of bloody Commodore convention? Anyway, he's gone now too. So, Tramiel's no more, replaced by Marshall Smith. Smith goes down in history as the man who was president at the time of Commodore's deal to buy the Amiga, and that's about it. He's certainly much more genial than Jack, but he has none of his drive and grit. By the time the Amiga came around, Commodore's empire was in collapse. The company was losing millions upon millions of dollars in 1985. One could point to a total failure to make any upgrades to the C64. There was the Plus 4, but it was largely treated as a joke, just another Commodore non-upgrade because no one at the top was ever willing to spend anything, and a product that was started under Jack but would have never come out under his purview. The new team felt they had to see it through even though it was clearly a dog. However, that's not even close to the full reason. This story, not just of Commodore, but of the home computer as a whole in America, has a very definitive end. Since 1977, the American people had been told this: you need a home computer. You don't just want one, or would desire to have one, you need it. It's going to be so important. If you don't get a home computer, you have literally failed your children as a parent. This wasn't a con job. For the most part, the people behind the computers, Jobs, Wozniak, Peddle, et al., believed absolutely in the necessity of the computer. To bolster this, there were all sorts of demonstrations, examples of the brilliant stuff you could do with your computer, how it apparently made life so much easier. Do your shopping list with the computer, do your budget, your taxes, your homework, your room plan, your contact list, your everything. It can all be done with the computer. And yes, you can do all these things, but it does take quite a lot of work. The average person isn't going to feel confident about doing this when they turn on their computer and all they encounter is a blue screen saying "ready" and nothing else. It's like, so what now? The truth is, a great deal of the American people had been sold a computer, had turned it on a few times, been befuddled by it each time, were too impatient to learn the programming know-how required to do these things that they apparently could do, and, well, they'd promptly shoved it in an attic somewhere never to be used again. It's not exactly difficult to find a good condition vintage home computer in America, probably a lot easier than it is to find one over here, because this was, quite a lot of the time, their fate. Guidance was confusing and difficult to come by, especially as more and more computers were now sold on the mass merchandise shelves and not in the shops of dealers who actually had a clue about them. In 1984, the American public finally asked the question, why? Why do we need a computer? And the computer's response was found to be wanting, because truthfully, in this period, you didn't need a home computer. That's the sad truth. You had not failed your kids by not getting them a computer. They would still be able to do their homework just fine, and they didn't need to know BASIC to pass a school year. There appeared to be no actual advantage to doing all these things like your shopping list or contact list or whatever on a computer, as opposed to just doing it on freaking paper like you'd always done before. It was just, to be American about it, a big old pain in the ass. And a pain in the wallet. By not getting a computer, you certainly save yourself a lot of money. Not just on the computer, but on all the other crap you need to do all these things that the supposed and virtually fictional modern computer family does. Printers, monitors, modems, extra disk drives, and a crap ton of software. And so the public said no, we don't think we need computers in our lives. And so the American home computer industry fell through the floor. That was why the American computer crash happened. There was one thing, one market, that kept the home computer industry from total annihilation: the gamers. The thing that everyone marketed out of the side of their mouth. You don't want to admit that the best thing the computer does is games, even though it clearly is. I mean, everyone knows load *8 1 and 1. How many of you could name 10 other basic commands? Even while the sky was falling, games stayed strong. The C64, as one of the best and most affordable gaming computers out there, survived on that. The one true American challenger to Nintendo's console-based dominance, with a long life that ensured its place as the greatest selling single home computer of all time. And of course, as we've mentioned plenty of times, the story in Europe was different. We never had that huge price war, the scorched earth policy, or indeed, in spite of whatever Sir Clive thought, the belief that the home microcomputer was ever good at anything besides games. We were just fine. I've digressed a little from our video's main subject, but not really. A great deal of the blame for the home computer crash has to be assigned to Jack Tramiel, for his bitter war with Texas Instruments, and for forcing computers into the mass market in such a way. He won, but it was an utterly Pyrrhic victory. When all that everybody knows is that you apparently need a home computer, it isn't going to be long before they start questioning that. And when that happened, home computers were doomed. The game was up. It would take another 10 years and the rise of the internet for home computers to truly be necessary, by which time they were much easier to understand. Back then no one knew what they were buying and no one knew what they were selling. The spectre of Jack cast a shadow over Commodore for the rest of their existence. It hurt the Amiga a great deal. This was a computer that absolutely had to be sold at a specialist, not least because those things aren't ever going to be on the big shelves again. Unfortunately, Jack had burnt the bridges to almost every specialist dealer out there, and then he'd pissed on the ashes. Quite understandably, a lot of dealers told Commodore to get lost. Tramiel himself would have similar trouble when he took over Atari, but not to the extent that Commodore had it. It didn't matter that the Amiga was such a trailblazer, it took a lot to convince anyone to get in bed with the snake again, and plenty chose not to. Somewhere, of course, we should draw a line. At some point I do intend to cover the Amiga and Atari ST in fuller detail than I've done in the past. It would be rude not to cover Jack's final glorious battle and ultimate defeat. However, it would also double this video's length, and then some. One has to draw a line somewhere and say, that's a story for another day. My opinion on Tramiel is kind of complex. For all his brutality and the gross shit he did, you almost have to admire his brilliance as a businessman and marketeer. He dragged the entirety of home computers kicking and screaming behind him, but he certainly didn't do it in a way that makes him in any way endearing. It would be hard to survive working for him, but you would absolutely believe in him. He treated every working day like it would be his last, until it was, at least at Commodore. In the end, I'm not sure if there's ever been another one quite like him. He was never motivated by greed. Even if he wasn't making any money at all, even if there was no question of ever making money, he would still have a complete and total desire to be at the top. Imagine how far he'd have gone if all those years back he'd stayed in the army. The full version of one of Tramiel's most famous quotes sums him up for me, and is a good way to finish. Business is war. I don't believe in compromising, I believe in winning. On January 13th, 1984, Jack walked out of his final showdown with the chairman of Commodore, Irving Gould. He would not return. Days later, it was announced to the world that Jack had quit Commodore, the company that he had built and run as his own since 1956. The global reaction was one of utter shock, with Commodore coming off their greatest single year, one where they had made over $1 billion. In other quieter quarters, some may well have said good riddance, raising a glass. Those many dealers say who were burned by Tramiel's business practices and tendency to screw people like them over. Some others inside Commodore, particularly those who saw or heard Jack's apparently climactic bust-up with Gould behind closed doors at the Winter CES show, may not have been surprised. They said that on that day, they saw Jack express an emotion that no one had ever seen up to that point: defeat. Jack Tramiel was 55 years old with a vast personal fortune. He had spent decades working like an absolute dog, like every day was his last, driving his company forward as if it were the centre of a war machine. When you grow up as he did, you take every day with the knowledge that it could all go away tomorrow. Business was never about money to Jack, it was about victory. Some may say that he took business too much to heart, to which he would agree and plough straight on harder than before. But now, he had lost. More than ever he was aware of his age, and every one of those battles he had fought could be read in his face. He wanted to spend more time with Helen, his loving wife of 37 years. He wanted to play with his grandkids. He looked at one of his former hotshot managers, Kit Spencer of Commodore UK, who had decided to cash in his chips, take early retirement and live a life of leisure in the Bahamas, and thought, you know what, maybe there's something in that. No more Jack attacks, no more price wars, no more computers. It's time for Jack to give it a rest. Elsewhere in the US, a calamity was happening. Atari had once been the Sun Gods, the breakout company of the 1970s, and that seems like a lifetime ago. They'd never followed up the 2600, the 5200 was a failure, they'd failed to buy the Famicom, and then, thanks to a flooded market, the rise of the home computers and a total lack of control to the point where you could play 2600 games on a freaking ColecoVision, the video game market collapsed. The home computer market for Atari wasn't much better. They'd never succeeded there, with the 800 and its follow-ups lagging behind everyone else. They were winning up the rear. In 1983, the company lost $500 million. Its parent company, Warner Communications, had seen their stock price halved thanks to this. There was the distinct possibility that the failure of Atari could actually sink Warner as a whole. They were desperate to sell them off. And all the while, well, Jack had done some travelling, played with his grandkids a bit, probably slept in some, and he was bored. Life seemed to lack the breakneck pace it once had. It didn't take long at all for Jack to realise that a life of leisure wasn't really for him, and he longed to be back out there. Only a couple of months after leaving Commodore, he'd formed a new company, Tramiel Technology, his own name purposefully misspelt in order to reflect how it was actually pronounced. Their aim was, of course, the creation of a new home computer, even though by this time some could already see that the boom period of computing was heading closer to its brutal end. But then, as ever, financial sense isn't exactly the only thing that's motivating Jack. There's a couple of things in the main. This time he truly wanted his own family business, something that he would make successful and then leave to his sons, the thing that he could never have while under the thumb of Irving Gould. And of course, speaking of which, as we know, Jack couldn't ever leave a slight unanswered, let alone being forced out of the company he created. If you thought that Jack's vendetta against Texas Instruments was bad, it was nothing compared to the vendetta that Jack now had against his former company. He created Commodore, and now he's going to kill it. And so, the stars aligned. A hungry, remotivated Jack desperate to get back in the big time, and a parent company desperate to sell off their ailing former superstar. Soon their paths would cross. After not all that much negotiation, Jack Tramiel bought Atari's Consumer Electronics and Home Computer division on July 1st, 1984. It's another amazing Jack deal. Essentially, Warner all but gave the division away to Jack, with Tramiel on his end paying nothing up front, agreeing to $240 million to Warner long term and a 32% share for Warner in Tramiel Technology. The then CEO of Atari, James Morgan, literally walked in the office one day to be told that Tramiel was coming into the office, so clear out all your rubbish. Atari's divisions had always worked independently of each other, and he had no desire to buy the arcade games wing of the company. Computers were his only interest. And so it made sense for Jack to buy that only and rechristen Tramiel Technology as Atari Corporation. Warner kept hold of the arcade division, but only for another year before selling it to Namco. Jack was back. The first days of Jack's command at Atari were, in a word, bloody. First off, he got together his team. Obviously, he had his sons Gary, Leonard and Sam, experts in respectively the worlds of finance, tech and management. He also had ex-Commodore people who rode with him, former members of what was dubbed his inner family, people like John Fegans, Tony Takai, and the then head of Commodore's engineering, Shiraz Shivji, made the jump directly from Jack's former company to Atari. Even before the creation of any new computer, the loss of several Commodore key figures to Tramiel was a huge right hook to the head, and shattered the already wavering confidence people had in his replacement, Marshall Smith. Remember this: for all of Jack's bad qualities and for all the people who said they would never work for him again, there were plenty of people who would in a heartbeat, and did. Important people. Takai and Shivji especially were big frickin' deals. If you want to fight a war, if you want to work for someone who you know damn well is going to drive you forwards, you go ahead and work for Jack. You'll get all the excitement and danger you can eat, and you sure as hell won't be bored with your ass on the line every single day. And at this time, Commodore were not exactly driving forwards anywhere except possibly off a cliff. Another huge punch was less direct but just as impactful: Commodore's latest dog of a computer, the Plus/4. This was actually a product started under Jack, and he's pictured with it. Presumably this was taken at that fateful Winter CES show in 1984. The Plus/4 and the rest of the 264 line, including the Commodore 16, were originally designed as very low-end business computers with productivity software built into them. But really the computer looked utterly past it in 1984, the software itself was poor, and there were serious compatibility issues with the C64. It was not a good product. The new Commodore management team inherited the computer, and Marshall Smith, with all the expertise in computers he'd built up from a lifetime in steel, thought that they should continue on with the product and treat it as a major upgrade, which it wasn't, and everyone could see that. The Plus/4 was a total failure, and it was the flooding of such wasteful products into the market that was probably one of the factors in the imminent crash of the market that we've covered already. Still, I mentioned blood. The first major mission was the reorganisation of Atari's computer division, or more accurately, the organisation of it if you consider how Atari had worked previously. Jack's lieutenants, the likes of Fegans and Leonard, went marching through every Atari building they now had. The aim? Take anyone who seems like they have a clue, and anyone else gets the chop. These were exciting times for the average Atari employee. You never knew if today would be your last day. Everyone was talking about whole buildings, once filled with hundreds of employees, now lying empty as the new management had decided there was nothing worth saving in them. And then your day comes. To take the example of just one former Atari programmer, a guy named Landon Dyer, you all get a chance to show your worth. A 5-minute interview where you're peppered with questions, either individually or as part of a group. Other than that, the lieutenants will not talk with you. You might think 5 minutes not enough time to really sell yourself, to which Jack would say, tough shit. A couple of hours later you all meet up and the lieutenants read out 2 lists of names. The longer list consists of those who'll be sleeping in tomorrow morning. The shorter list consists of those who, for now, will be working with the Tramiels. Landon was on the shorter list, and he would end up working hard on the development of the Atari ST. There were fun parts of being on that shorter list for engineers, programmers and the like. There's stories of all these bog-standard foot soldiers now happily requesting and getting the use of plushy desks and chairs that once belonged to now-fired vice presidents, all sorts of things like that. But of course there would soon be the breakneck task of, in classic Tramiel style, working on a brand new computer in no time at all. This had served Jack well in the past. When he'd given folks like Chuck Peddle, Al Charpentier and Bob Yanez a mere couple of months to come up with their brand new products in the past, they'd come up with the PET and the C64. And soon enough the surviving teams at Atari would experience these joys for themselves. But first off, there is the matter of a brand new computer coming very close to falling right into Jack Tramiel's lap. Now, back in the rise and fall of the Commodore Amiga, I rather simplified the possibility of the Amiga being made by Atari, and hell, even doing that I actually managed to get it won. The truth is the whole thing is unbelievably complex. I'm going to try my best to get through it with what I know. We're going back to the start of 1984, a time when there's a struggling company called Amiga with a strong prototype of a Motorola 68000 based computer called the Lorraine, but no one to sell it to. They're kind of close to hitting the wall. Atari, not owned by Tramiel yet, are also struggling, seeing as basically nothing they're creating is making any money. Hemorrhaging money and stuff, they're gonna need to buy something in if they want to have something to plug the holes. The punitive "here's $500,000, pay us back in weeks or we'll take the computer from you" deal Amiga had was actually made by old Atari, not Tramiel. Their aim, basically, was to screw Amiga as much as possible, get them to spend that money working on the computer before they inevitably default and Atari take it. Cause how on earth were Amiga gonna get that money back? Their income lay in joysticks before the Amiga came around, and that had died with the video game crash. It was like signing up to be disemboweled. Amiga had talked to various other people about their new computer, including reportedly Jack himself at one point, but Atari seemed like the only option. And then Commodore stepped in. This was perhaps one of the advantages of having a new management at the helm. Commodore, desperate enough themselves, approached things in a more genteel and supportive way, probably in a way that Tramiel, the supreme king of hardball who probably looked at Atari's original deal with admiration, wouldn't have done. And as a mark of good faith in their own negotiations with Amiga, they wrote a cheque for the $500,000. David Morse, the CEO of Amiga, promptly took the cheque to Atari personally and then immediately severed their relationship. It was a perfect move for Amiga. They'd had that money from Atari to improve their computer, they'd paid it back, and now they had no further obligations to them. Not long after this, the negotiations were completed, and Commodore buys Amiga completely for $27 million. When Jack arrived at Atari, it didn't take long for legal squabbles between him and his former company to begin. Commodore immediately sued people like Shivji for leaving and taking tech with them, which was promptly returned. Harmful, but the upshot of it all was basically that Shivji was prevented from taking up his new post for a few weeks. The eventual blows that Jack would land on discovering this old contract between Amiga and Atari would be far greater. He launched a lawsuit first against Morse and Amiga, then against Commodore and former Atari employee stroke creator of the Amiga, Jay Miner, contesting that the deal between Morse and Atari was conducted in bad faith on behalf of Morse, and that technology had been stolen from Atari in the creation of the Amiga. A brutal 2.5-year-long legal battle ensued, the results of which will never be known. However, it is believed that Atari very much came out on top, and Commodore had to pay their legal costs. Because, well, they were probably right on both counts, or certainly it was hard to legally deny both of these things. And yet you could hardly blame Amiga or Morse for it. They were up against the wall themselves against a company that was dead set on screwing them. Such are the grey areas of the courts. Anyway, that's about as much as can be said about that. By the time Jack arrived at Atari, the Amiga ship had already set sail. Instead, we ought to start looking at the creation of what would become known in the press as the Jackintosh. People have long wanted me to cover the Atari ST in more detail. It's a massive request on the channel that I'm quite happy to fulfill now. Once again, Jack offered a brutal timeframe for, essentially, the creation of a new competitive computer from scratch. He wanted a working prototype for 1985's Winter CES show, which by the time reorganisation had happened and people like Shivji were put in place, was about 5 months away. However, looking at it from the management side, Tramiel's rushing was not without ground. All of Atari's existing products, from the 2600 to the 8-bit computer line, were dead in the water now. There was virtually no money coming in from these machines, and Jack wouldn't be able to hold out forever. Something had to come quickly, and it couldn't just be a fob-off. It had to be good, an actual signifier that Atari were alive and kicking. Realistically, the new computer had to be prototyped by January of '85, and then on the shelves by the summer if Atari were to stand a chance. So, yeah, there's no pressure at all. Now, some of the more mysterious things about the computer that need to be cleaned up. What does ST stand for? Something Tramiel? Maybe even Sam Tramiel? No, it stands for 1632, because the computer ran from a 32-bit processor off a 16-bit bus. Then there's the matter of its GUI operating system, the TOS. Now, the TOS is not the TOS. It's a combination of GEM, a graphical user interface, and GEM-DOS, a regular DOS interface, both of which were made by a company called Digital Research. Originally, the plan had been to use DR's flagship product, Gary Kildall's CP/M operating system, in the ST, But coding this fully 68,000 chip and getting everything to talk with each other proved to be a huge challenge, and Atari eventually went with GEM-DOS instead. The operating system was the major stopgap in getting the ST developed on time. TOS was the end result, and it stands for Lee Operating System, although it was usually referred to as Tramiel Operating System by those on the inside. There are many weird and wonderful things about the computer, one of the strangest becoming one of its biggest advantages. The ST hit shelves with a MIDI interface right out of the box, the first computer to do this. It seems strange because normally Tramiel would never allow such fanciful things to be shipped with a computer. The philosophy always was that the computer has what it needs to work out of the box, and then anything else can be sold via expansion. It seems as though the MIDI interface was used to make easier one of the shadier practices of the typical convention dog and pony show. It wasn't uncommon for people to demonstrate the audio capabilities of their computer while working a synthesizer under the table. Still, the MIDI interface in the Atari ST meant that the computer was, for years, very popular with musicians. Suddenly, a small producer of electronic music doesn't need tons of cash to get a computer studio setup together. The ST was music friendly in other ways, and its high memory, very high for the time with 2MB and 4MB models eventually available before anyone else, meant that it could even handle sampling. It was the computer for electronic music for several years. Both Cubase and Logic, two of the world's most popular audio sequencer programs today, started out on the Atari ST. Of course, it's not surprising that such odd things would end up thrown onto the machine, given the chaotic nature of the time frame. The actual building of the computer was relatively smooth, Shivji and company handling it with ease. It is often said, of course, that they were still pretty much working on documentation they'd done for Commodore. Even if they didn't have it, those ideas were already there. But as mentioned, the tough part was getting the operating system to work. Something about CP/M and the 68,000 didn't mix at all, and it soon became clear that if they were going to work together, it would require months upon months of development. CP/M was a big name, but that was time that Atari didn't have. GEM-DOS was an altogether cruder way of doing things, but it did work. However, there would of course be jack attacks for those who'd wasted too much damn time. If it's not ready, it's not ready, and you're to blame. The end result is a capable operating system, but very buggy and crude. In the end, the initial Atari STs had to ship with the TOS on disk, which was great, especially considering that loading it up left only a few kilobytes of memory for coding and other applications. This was soon fixed and existing STs were updated free of charge. Somehow, almost on the day of the CES show itself, the programmers at Atari managed to get GEM onto the ST and show it off, where reviews were very positive. Basically, the Atari ST is a very good computer indeed. I always say that if I had the ST instead of the Amiga, I would happily be a big fan of it. It's a lovely little thing, with many good qualities. It has its own quirks like every other machine, but if the question is the Atari ST a capable computer that's worthy of fighting the soon-to-come Amiga, as well as the Macintosh and all other computers of the time? Well, the answer is a definite yes. Now though, we have to get to the nitty-gritty of selling the thing, and then go into war. Power without the price. The new Jack Tramiel slogan, and one that could hardly be argued with. The Atari ST provided power that was right up there with the Apple Macintosh, along with the GUI and so forth that was steadily becoming more popular, and it did it at the cost of $999, including a colour monitor. That's way less than half of the cost of the likes of the Macintosh Plus, machines that will set you back around $2,500. Another good thing to say about Tramiel: his marketing slogans are never fully bullshit. There's a solid kernel of truth to most of them. While Jack Tramiel never actually went to all-out war with Apple in the way he'd done with TI and was about to do with Commodore, he was always happy to compare their products with his. Indeed, the original GEM operating system was very similar to that of the Lisa, to the point where Apple sued Digital Research. However, the Atari version of GEM wasn't included in that, and that GEM was allowed to remain quite similar to the Mac's operating system. Okay, I say there isn't bullshit about the slogans, although there is a little bullshit in the way that the ST and such computers are marketed that should be addressed, just so we know full well where these machines stand. If you watch enough Commodore or Atari adverts from the Tramiel era, you'll notice how often their computers are compared to Apples of the time, or the IBM PC. It helps to compare those computers to them, as they are the high end of, respectively, the creative and business markets, and computers being what they are, there's always going to be some numbers that compare pretty well. But of course, things like memory or power in this instance aren't the only things that make a computer. Hell, numbers aren't everything at all. The software is where it really counts in many ways. But it is good for the home user to feel like they're getting something comparable with the business computers. But in the eyes of big business, the likes of Commodore and Atari, hell even Apple, weren't ever serious business computers. They lacked the serious business software image, or more importantly, the established business operating system. The fact is, back in the 1980s, a computer with a GUI was not actually taken all that seriously. They were seen as toys by big business. The GUI often took a lot of the computer's power to 1 too, meaning they were also too slow for purpose. No, for a lot of businesses, the only system that would do was MS-DOS, and to a much lesser extent CP/M, and that was one of the IBM PC's most crucial advantages. It would take until Windows 3.1 for this image to really change. We'll get back to software soon, as on the other end of that spectrum, the Atari ST would end up seriously falling down here. But for now, it wasn't long before the Atari ST acquired the Jackintosh nickname, and it wasn't exactly a derogatory one. Gradually, even in a shrunken computer market, the ST was becoming the standout player on the convention circuit in the first half of '85, always impressing at its demonstrations. Commodore, on the other hand, seemed to be taking things slower. Their main product currently was the Commodore 128, their final 8-bit machine. This was everything that the 264 wasn't, an actual meaningful upgrade of the old C64, including, at long last, an update of the BASIC that every Commodore computer had used since 1977. It wasn't exactly a computer that looked to the future, but the C128 was a nice way to say goodbye to the 8-bits. And it sold well, managing to gather a couple of million units even in these difficult times. The Amiga was now a mystery. It had absolutely staggered the crowds at the 1984 Winter CES show, where the bouncing ball had shown the crowd things thought impossible. But after that, it had all gone quiet. The continued development of the machine was under wraps, and Commodore refused to show their hand. The 1985 Winter CES show passed with virtually no Amiga present. The summer, though, would be different. The Amiga finally kicked into gear at the summer 1985 CES show, with a largely complete A1000 ready to go. The old demos, bouncing ball and the like, were still impressive, but so were most of the other things that the computer could do. For those in attendance, it was stunning. The machine had long been dubbed as the computer of the future, and, well, it fit the billing. A full launch wasn't far behind, taking place at the Vivian Beaumont Theatre in New York with Andy Warhol drawing Debbie Harry. Before finally the Amiga started shipping in September. But things would go pretty badly from then on out for Commodore. It was their intention to sell the Amiga in specialist computer stores, to do away with the mass-market toy-based image they'd had under Tramiel, and to treat the Amiga like the special product it was. But those computer stores could hardly forget what had happened the last time they'd had dealings with Commodore. Again, another delayed punch in the face. Tramiel's terrible treatment of retailers meant that a sizable amount of them weren't interested in dealing with Commodore again, even though Tramiel wasn't at the helm. It was also $500 more than the ST, which didn't help matters much. And so began a lengthy war. By and large, the computers are very comparable. The Atari may well be shoddier in some regards, but it got out of the blocks a hell of a lot faster. By the way, you may well ask, how come Jack Tramiel didn't have as much trouble as Commodore did in terms of dealers and whatnot, considering his own reputation? Well, it's kind of simple. Atari, before Tramiel came in, already had a bunch of dealers, so they were working with Tramiel now whether they liked it or not. Guess who had cut ties with every single dealer before they were unceremoniously kicked out of their previous company? Yep. The Amiga just crawled out of the doors of Commodore. Even if you wanted one, you'd struggle or wait a long time to actually get one. The marketing power they once had was no longer there. Funnily enough, that left them the moment Tramiel departed. Once again, Irving Gould is probably more interested in sunning himself on his yacht. Marshall Smith can get himself out of his mess. But Smith was not Tramiel, and never could be, that much was clear. Commodore tried other things in the meantime. They released their first IBM PC XT clones, some business-oriented computers, but they weren't going to be enough. At the end of 1985, Commodore reported a brutal $237 million loss. As the computer market continued to shrink, they were amongst the very worst hit. Their share price, once at a high of $65 during Tramiel's reign, was now hitting as low as $5. And the tech papers did not make good reading, full of those anticipating the giant's inevitable downfall. In the end, Marshall Smith would take the hit. He stayed within Commodore, but in March of 1986 he was demoted to director. Gould will replace him with then North America CEO Thomas Rattigan, whose first order of business was the severe cutting of costs, anyway, anyhow, anywhere. Rattigan had done as good as he possibly could with the initial launch of the Amiga, had negotiated an injection of $135 million into the company that basically saved them from extinction, and he could have certainly been a formidable opponent. Of course, this is the point where the actual numbers of the war, the sales of the computers, start to deviate away from North America. The home computer just wasn't really a thing anymore. People had been burned too much, the market was still shrinking. Neither the Atari ST nor the Amiga 1000, as it would eventually be known, would ever find any major success in their home country. The home market was going and the business market was locked down. Nor would they find success in Japan, where the likes of NEC or Sharp dominated proceedings. While there'll be plenty of squabbling in the States, the true battleground for these two computers was in Europe, where the ST had already taken a solid lead, hitting the market first and scoring big wins in what had previously been the home of Commodore in Europe, West Germany. The Germans loved Jack, and for now, they were happy to switch their colours to the new company of their old boss. There were other markets too, such as France, where the Atari ST would forever have an iron grip. The Amiga could never match the ST in that country. In others still, there was everything to play for, but for the most part, the early days of the war are being won by the ST, thanks to the general lousy launch of the Amiga. Jack, for his part, didn't mind too much where the money was coming from. Even if the computer wasn't setting the States on fire, Atari were doing well in other areas. They could grow on that. Irving Gould, on the other hand, did mind. Rattigan, in his year as CEO, had done a great job with stabilising the ship at Commodore. He'd made the necessary cuts, had overseen a redo of the venerable C64 that saw this long-toothed veteran still shift units, he'd gradually got the company closer to the black, and he'd improved the company's standing in Europe with the help of PCs. The only trouble was that sales in the States were down, but they were down for everyone. And this was the reasoning that Irving Gould used, in 1987, to unceremoniously dump him from the company in a great suave of acrimony. This decision was even more baffling, in most people's eyes, than the one to drop Tramiel. How on earth could Rattigan be let go, after what he'd done? Rattigan himself suspected, probably correctly, that it was mostly about his personality clashing with Gould's. He was a lot more hard-nosed and, well, kind of Tramiel-esque than the likes of Marshall Smith had been, and Gould probably didn't like that. Naturally, a successful lawsuit for wrongful dismissal followed as Commodore continued to be in disarray. It might even have been because Gould was jealous of Rattigan's accomplishments, even taking exception to a cover interview that he'd given for Commodore's official magazine. What a fantastically petty man. And who takes over the reins at Commodore? Who do you think? What about the man who's truly been in control this whole time? Yep, Irving Gould's replacement CEO for Thomas Rattigan was Irving Gould. Suddenly, Tramiel and Gould are face to face on the battlefield. Well, maybe not. I doubt that Gould spent any less time in the Bahamas because of this change in position. What's more important is just what tools are coming over from the States for the war in Europe. Where's the support for our boys up front? Before his unceremonious departure, however, Rattigan had laid up the ball, and no matter the level of competence that was now going to be the norm at Commodore's management with his absence, it wouldn't take much to dunk it in. It was remarkable. Now really, there's no need to mince words. Come the end of 1986, the Amiga was virtually dead. The former Amiga Inc. team behind it had virtually all been let go as a part of both Smith's cost-cutting and Rattigan's. Production on the Amiga 1000 had effectively stopped in the summer of 1986, and whatever little sales they had were filled comfortably by their remaining inventory. The 1000, while such a revolutionary computer, was flawed in several critical ways. It lacked the expansion power required for a hardcore computer pro, and the price was too high for the home user. And it was aimed at a business market that was already locked down by IBM. It was brilliant, but a lack of focus killed it. The war against Atari, at this stage, looked to be over. If all Commodore could offer from a sales point of view was the C64's Twilight Tour and a bunch of PC clones, then Atari would ultimately win comfortably. But Rattigan's great move was essentially to split the Amiga into two. One powerful model for the professionals, another smaller model for the home. The A2000, a great deal more powerful than the original 1000, was filled with tools for the professionals, the video makers and the like, who were getting to grips with the machine. But the 500 was the model that would finally get the Amiga selling like hotcakes. A respectable computer, comparable to the baseline ST, at a decent price and aimed directly at the games market. Even though they'd lost many people over the years, Commodore still had amazing engineers at their Westchester plant, and they made these machines happen. Come Christmas of 1987, they would arrive. It was far from perfect, the marketing still just wasn't there, and Commodore were, in actual fact, too desperate to court the old computer shops back to their side. This was a games-oriented computer, and the computer retailers even dropped hints to Commodore that such a thing might actually benefit from a limited release onto mass-market shelves. But this didn't happen. One trouble that the A500 had in America was that a whole lot of people just didn't know it existed. Commodore's marketing was that rubbish. Oh, and as expected, Gould was basically running the company by phone from whatever tax haven he happened to be in at the time. His replacements as CEO, the likes of Max Toy and Howard Copperman, were more in the vein of Marshall Smith than Rattigan. And that's before we get to frickin' Mehdi Ali. On the side we're covering though, well, things aren't going that great. The blunt fact was that while the Atari ST had a great deal more marketing than the Amiga did, it still wasn't exactly selling in brilliant numbers, certainly not in North America. Neither computer was ever fighting for the #1 spot. Macintoshes and PC clones were always ahead of them. In Europe the Atari did better, but that was soon about to change with the arrival of the A500. The Atari had a core base of people who loved it thanks to several of its big plus points, the MIDI interface, the masses of memory it provided and what have you, but that wasn't a big user base, and as Tramiel already knew, once that user base was filled up, no one was going to be buying any more STs. Once again, the gaming market was going to provide the shift, as the Amiga 500 quickly established itself as the top gaming computer for the rest of the decade. It was so well suited to games that even more advanced Macs and the like, running off of a Motorola 68020s, could barely compete with it. In Europe the A500 hit hard in several key markets. Commodore won back Germany, which became the machine's home again, selling hundreds of thousands of units. It would become a massive seller in the UK, selling in terrific numbers there too. The age-old Commodore practice of letting their worldwide divisions run largely autonomously paid off here, as the likes of David Pleasance created a home for the Amiga that the US executives could only dream about. It took a while to overhaul Atari's lead in Europe, and it still prospered in some countries, but ultimately, around about 1989, and thanks to the onslaught of an untold amount of entertainment packs along with games that the Atari ST just wasn't able to handle, the Amiga overhauled the ST for good. In the States, the last gasp of the Amiga happened in Christmas 1989, when the computer finally arrived on some mass-market shelves, far too late, accompanied by a big ad campaign with tons of celebrities that didn't achieve much. After that, it was basically gone. So, to sum up, the great reversal of fortune would happen in the games market. Despite being very comparable to the Amiga in many ways and usually having a lot more power, it lacked certain things that gradually people who programmed for the Amiga were able to harness more and more. The The Amiga's blitter, for example, was far superior to Atari's and lair from the beginning, allowing for much smoother graphics and scrolling. Horizontal scrolling in particular was something that Atari really struggled with. It took a while, and there were plenty of games that became famous on both systems and were indeed fairly interchangeable. Dungeon Master, originally an ST title, is a good example. An even better example, one that ironically became one of the Amiga's flagship titles, is Bullfrog's Populous. The engine was originally created on an Atari ST, and then ported over to the Amiga during development, harnessing virtually none of the aforementioned things that made an Amiga stand out. ST port is one of the worst things you can usually say about an Amiga game, and Populous is an ST port. However, Amiga's games would eventually leave the STs standing. A good example for comparison is a rather familiar title by now, Shadow of the Beast from Psygnosis. Here's the Amiga, and here's the Atari ST. Pretty noticeable difference, isn't it? Anyway, technical differences aside, once the A500 became known as the gaming computer, that was the kiss of death. If we know anything from the likes of, say, the Dreamcast, we know this. A game's computer or console lives and dies by the people who make games for them. The A500 was able to bring all the big guns, the likes of Electronic Arts and what have you, back to Commodore. And the ST didn't have them. The Amiga had the people who could do wonderful things with the machine, and the Atari ST did not. For the big companies it became the afterthought, the system that one sad person's working on ports for in the corner, while everyone else is crowded around the Amigas and showing off their latest tech demos. The Atari could happily compete and even far outstrip the Amiga in plenty of areas, but in games, it couldn't. And as always seems to be the case, games is where it really mattered. The rest of the Amiga story is of course a tale of continued European success but ultimately stagnation, as the machine failed to be meaningfully advanced further thanks to the incompetence of Commodore's executives, including, of course, one Mehdi Ali. Ultimately, the MS-DOS machine rises thanks to the onset of better graphics cards, processors and the like, and that takes over the computer gaming market from Amiga at the start of the 90s. But what is Atari's side of this story? It had been a long and punishing war, filled with untold amounts of litigation, brutal advertising, all the hallmarks of one of the computing world's most lethal operators. But ultimately, the ST, while a really good computer, had a ceiling, and they'd reached it. Once the A500 took over the gaming market, the war was essentially lost. It was around this time that Atari started to concentrate on other consumer electronics products aside from computers. And now for Jack, well, it was time to take a back seat. He'd done what he could. He'd always wanted a family business that he could leave to his sons, and at the very least he was going to be able to do that now. And so, around the end of the 1980s, Jack Tramiel gradually left day-to-day operations at Atari, transferring them mostly to the management-oriented son, Sam. These years of Atari are of course defined largely by products that mean well, but are in many ways somewhat hamstrung and lack the commercial appeal of their betters. The Atari 7800 was something of an attempt to return the brand to the games consoles they were once known for, but it keeled over almost at the sight of Nintendo's dominance. The Atari Lynx, brought in from Epix, was in many ways a good and advanced handheld for the time, but was scuppered by way too much power consumption and once again Nintendo, this time with the Game Boy. The Jaguar tried to throw a big spanner into the bit wars of the 90s, proclaiming 64 bits at a time when such a number seemed impossible. But the fact that bits weren't everything, and that there were never enough developers on the machine side for its full power to ever even remotely be harnessed, killed the system pretty quickly. When Atari lost the games market way back when, they pretty much lost it forever. And while the ST continued to putter along, mostly thanks to Europe, ultimately that won out, and the machine was fully discontinued in 1993. In the end, the main source of income for Atari came from lawsuits. These weren't the best years, that's for damn sure. Ultimately, Jack once again found himself at the head of the company, taking the day-to-day reins back in 1995 after Sam suffered a heart attack, which he recovered from. By this stage though, all of Atari's products were failing and they weren't making any money. It was time to get out. In 1996, the Atari Corporation was effectively ended by a merger with JTS Corp, followed quickly by a sale to Hasbro for $5 million. Hasbro were the then holders of the Atari Interactive division, and their purchase of the corporation, or at least its branding, finally brought the two divisions back together again, where they were soon sold again, this time as a whole, to Infogrames. And that's roughly where we are with Atari today. After this, Jack's work got a lot lighter. He took on director roles here and there, but finally, at this stage, over 65 years old, Jack let the burners rest. He concentrated more on his role as a co-founder of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, which he'd helped establish in 1993, and in which capacity he spoke of his own experiences as a survivor across the country. He happily spoke at conventions of his career in the industry, one of the highest profile figures to do so, and was free to be interviewed plenty of times about his history at Commodore and Atari. He personally dedicated a memorial stone at the museum to Vernon Tott, the soldier who he credited with liberating him from Arnhem on his death in 2003. Finally, survived by Helen and his 3 sons, Jack Tramiel passed away on April 8, 2012 at the age of 83. And so we reach the end of our look at Jack Tramiel. It's certainly been interesting. He has many different qualities to him as a person, as well as several things that are pretty damn dislikable. There's a lot of things that Jack did, in particular the way that he treated some of the engineers who built those key products that got Commodore up and running in the computer business, that are pretty hard to forgive. But there's lots to admire about him too. The way that he could drive his business forward and get people to work for him utterly, and how he treated business like almost no one else. In the end though, it's utterly important to recognise the huge contribution that Tramiel made to computers the world over. After all, history is written by the winners. In this great computer story, it is common for the early achievements of the likes of Apple, of Microsoft and so forth to be celebrated over everybody else. Commodore in the end were not winners, neither were Atari. Tramiel ultimately lost. But to disregard that story, as some have done, is to deny the huge impact they made and to create a false history. For there were times when Jack Tramiel stood astride the world of computing like a colossus, however brief they may have been. It is for us now to ponder just what the world of computing would look like now if Jack had ultimately come out on top, whether it was at Commodore or Atari. That's a tough question to answer, and the answer may not even necessarily be good. But such was his status as one of the true giants of the industry, in a playground filled with such people, that everything would have been completely different. Thank you so much for watching this video, The Last Stand of Jack Tramiel. If you like this video then do consider liking it, following me on my social media, subscribing to the channel and supporting me on Patreon. I'd also like to throw a quick shout out to the Nostalgia Nerd, who has his own Atari ST story up, so between me and him we've kinda got you covered as far as Jack and the Atari and all that good stuff goes. Go to his channel and give him a subscriber, why don't you? Tell him that Kim sent you. Right, let's thank some patrons now. Seth Robinson, Jason Leach, Horo Grizzly Bar, Ian Roberts, Drew Briggs, Grayson Blackpaw, Ben Coker, Martin Pataki, Taylor Armand, Mark Johnston, Twisted Squote, Mitchell Mann, Simon Gulliver, Andy Capt, Andrew Dalton, Johan Eriksson, David Page, Conformist, Jake Elwich, Hell O'Brien, Keith Barlow, Romeo, Peter Sidorn, Grant Butler, Vishadi, Tiago Pereira dos Santos Silva, Olaf Albin, Dragon Sex Master, Joel Hartman, Phil Taprog, Jamie Hampshire, Lee Norris, Tim Lintz, Robert Kelly, Craig Nellist, James Malloy, John Davenport, Jan Velton, Olaf Jonsson, James Halliday, Marco, Gianni Giacchetta, Richard Bearwell, Hagenator, Radek, Ken Barraclough, Alvaro Gonzalez, Stephen Hornsby, Jan Best, Robin Banks, Dan Roscoe, Christian Earnshaw, Francesco Pimenta, Kev Gilmore, Alexander Green, Thomas Daniels, Greg Olson, Mark Johnson, Stuart Ashen, Lee Harris, James Idd, Novel, Gerard Morris, Mike Siegler, Mark Brooks, Russell Hugo, Paolo Leary, Graham Kamak, Scott Mittin, Nicole Ketchum, Ninth Demon, and John Ezel. Thank you all so much as ever for your fantastic support. So next time on the channel, I think it's about time that we looked at the single worst ZX Spectrum game ever made. I'm sure that's going to be fun. I'm really looking forward to taking you on that journey. But for now it's time to say goodbye, so wherever you are and whoever you be, have a good one, take care, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.